Now, as far as properties go, there are a number of connection properties. These were added in addition to the clear pool and clear all pools methods. These were added in ADO.NET 2.0. And the first one is just pooling, okay? You can set pooling to true or false, and this just determines whether connections are pooled. But here are, you'll see some new ones in here. Enlist has a default of true, as pooling does, and enlist determines whether there should be automatic enlistment in the current transaction context. Okay, so when you have a transaction going, and we're going to talk a lot more about transactions later on when we talk about errors and error handling and how to work with transactions, but when you have a transaction going, if you want any connections to automatically be enlisted in that transaction, then you can set this enlist property. And as I say, the default is true, so it's really more if you don't want them to automatically be enlisted, then you would set this to false. And this applies especially for distributed transactions. There's also the load balance timeout, and these values in parentheses are all the default values. So the default for the load balance timeout is 0, and this is just the minimum seconds of lifetime in a pool. So, in other words, with 0, it's basically going to be disregarded. But if you set this, let's say, to 10, it means that every connection that you place in the pool will stay in the pool for at least 10 seconds, okay, even if otherwise it would not have stayed in the pool because it would have expired for some other reason, or because it just, you had other connections in the pool and it wasn't needed anymore, that kind of thing. All right, so this allows you to set the minimum seconds of lifetime in a pool. As you'll see later, you can also set a maximum. The pool size can be set to a maximum value, and that defaults to 100. So you can have up to 100 connections in any one pool. And again, this is just the maximum number of connections in the pool. And there's also a minimum that defaults to 0, the minimum number of connections in a pool. So if you want to be sure that you have at least 5 connections in the pool at all times, you can set this to 5, and it will keep adding the same connection if necessary over and over again. Will get added to the pool in order to bring you up to that minimum. Now there's also a connection lifetime property. This defaults to 0. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. But what this does is it limits the age of a connection, okay? And this age gets checked every time a connection's added to the pool. There's actually a creation time for every connection. And so when a connection is added to the pool, this is calculated by comparing the connection time to the current time in seconds, and that gives you an age in seconds for, every connection that's added to the pool. And so the age is going to be used to determine whether or not a connection should be added to the pool. If it's too old, then you can say we don't want to keep it around. So, for example, if we set a connection lifetime of 60, it would mean that if we tried to add a connection to a pool that had been created more than a minute ago, it would not get added to the pool. Only younger connections would be added to the pool. Now, the default setting of 0, that means we should never destroy it. In other words, it means don't, turn down any connections based on their age. There may be other reasons because you hit the max size of the pool, but don't discriminate based on the age of the connection. And this is especially useful for load balancing. It allows you to say, by limiting this, you can say, we want to let all of the old connections die out because, for example, we're going to be bringing on a new server in our load balancing set, in our, farm of servers, and we want to be sure that it gets used. So we want to be sure to sort of spread the load instead of just reusing all the old connections. There's also a connection reset that's true-false, and by default it's true. This causes the connection to be reset when it's retrieved from the pool. And one of the reasons this was exposed is that if you're working with SQL Server 7.0, you might want to set this to false because that reset actually causes an extra round trip to the server, and in some ways it mitigates, some of the advantage of using connection pooling, which is partly that you want to minimize the load on the server. So this was put in largely for people who are using SQL Server 7.0.